The congressional hearing room fell into a tense silence as Mark Levin, the conservative radio powerhouse known for his commanding voice and deep knowledge of the Constitution, leaned toward his microphone. His sharp eyes, framed by his glasses, locked on Representative Jasmine Crockett across the chamber. What unfolded in the next 30 seconds would go viral across the nation, leaving millions wondering, did the legendary Mark Levin just get outmatched by a freshman Congresswoman? Before we get into this intense exchange, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because what you're about to see is politics at its most unfiltered. This wasn't an ordinary congressional hearing. It was a clash of legal intellects that would test reputations and spark new ones. Tension had been simmering for weeks. Mark Levin, often called the Great One on conservative radio, had been invited to testify before the House Judiciary Committee about constitutional interpretation and executive authority. For decades, Levin had dominated talk radio with his booming delivery, sharp constitutional insights, and unyielding takedowns of liberal arguments. He'd authored best-selling books, shaped public debate, and built an empire as one of the most influential legal voices in conservative media. Facing him was Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas's 30th District. At first glance, she seemed an unlikely challenger, young, relatively new to Congress, and without Levin's long media pedigree. Yet those familiar with her background knew that beneath her calm demeanor was a formidable legal strategist, forged in Texas courtrooms where she had defended clients whose freedom hung in the balance. The hearing was expected to be routine. Levin would discuss constitutional originalism, field friendly questions from Republicans, sidestep criticism from Democrats, and leave with another highlight clip for his show. But from the moment Crockett adjusted her microphone and met Levin's gaze, everyone in the room realized this session would be anything but ordinary. "Mr. Levin," Crockett began, "Before we begin, I want to clarify our qualifications here. You've written extensively on constitutional law, haven't you?" Levin's lips curved into that familiar smirk his millions of listeners knew well, the one he wore right before dismantling an opponent on his show. What he didn't realize was that he was walking straight into a carefully set trap that would soon have the entire internet watching him struggle. To understand the scale of what was about to happen, you need to know who these two figures were. Mark Levin wasn't just another conservative commentator. He was considered constitutional royalty in right-wing circles. With a law degree from Temple University, experience in the Reagan administration, and best-selling books like Liberty and Tyranny and American Marxism, Levin had established himself as the conservative movement's legal philosopher king. Every night, millions tuned in to the Mark Levin Show to hear him dissect complex legal issues with the confidence of someone convinced he was always the smartest person in the room. His signature move was mocking the legal knowledge of liberal politicians and commentators. He'd often quip, "These people wouldn't know the Constitution if James Madison himself rose from the dead to explain it." Levin had built his reputation on intellectual dominance, especially regarding the law. Clips of him destroying what he called fake lawyers or affirmative action law degrees regularly went viral. His fans adored him for it, calling him the Great One, not ironically, but with real admiration. When Levin spoke about the law, conservatives listened, but Jasmine Crockett was not your typical freshman Congresswoman. Before entering politics, she was a civil rights attorney and public defender in Texas. She had argued in courtrooms where people's freedom depended on every word, where one legal point could determine decades of a person's life. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, Crockett had done more than just talk about the law. She had practiced it in places where it truly mattered. What most didn't know was that Crockett had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Her team gathered every instance of Levin mocking someone's legal education, every time he questioned a black woman's intellect or dismissed certain law schools as inferior. She studied his habits, his blind spots, and most importantly, his ego. The stakes were high. This wasn't merely a debate over constitutional interpretation. It was about who held authority to speak on constitutional issues in America. Whether the old guard of conservative media could continue dismissing diverse new voices in politics. It was about whether someone like Levin could keep profiting from intellectual arrogance when faced with someone who could challenge him fact for fact, case for case, precedent for precedent. For Levin, this was supposed to be routine. Another chance to prove conservative legal thought's superiority. He didn't realize he was about to face someone who had done something he hadn't in decades, actually practiced law in a courtroom where real lives were on the line. The committee room was packed. C-SPAN cameras were rolling. Conservative outlets had sent top correspondents, expecting sound bites of Levin owning the libs. Liberal media were there too, hoping someone would finally land a blow on the seemingly untouchable host. Social media was already alive with anticipation. The hashtag Levin vs. Crockett was trending before the first question was even asked. Behind Levin sat his team of researchers and aides, armed with binders of constitutional citations and quotes from the Founding Fathers. Behind Crockett sat a single aide with an iPad. She didn't need a team, she had something Levin hadn't anticipated: real courtroom experience and a strategy designed to turn his own arrogance against him. The first few minutes went exactly as Levin expected. He answered questions about constitutional originalism with trademark confidence, quoting the Federalist Papers from memory and name-dropping the Founding Fathers as if they were personal acquaintances. Republican members lobbed easy questions that let him showcase his expertise. He was in his element, performing for the cameras with the same confidence that fueled his radio empire. Then it was Crockett's turn. "Mr. Levin," she began, her tone professional but edged with precision that made the room lean in. "You've been very outspoken about the quality of legal education in America. In fact, just last month on your show you said, and I quote, 'Half these Democrats couldn't pass a first-year constitutional law exam if their lives depended on it.' Do you recall saying that?" Levin adjusted his glasses, a gesture his fans recognized as the moment before he went on the offensive. "I say many things on my show, Congresswoman, but yes, I stand by that. Too many politicians today lack a basic grasp of our constitutional framework." "I see," Crockett replied, calmly sorting the papers before her. "You've also said several times that certain law schools are, quote, degree mills handing out participation trophies instead of a real legal education. Is that another statement you stand by?" The room grew tense. Republican members shifted uneasily, sensing that Crockett was building toward something. Levin's voice grew louder, more assertive. "Absolutely. The decline in legal education is a major concern. When law schools care more about diversity quotas than academic rigor. When students can't even cite a Supreme Court case properly. Getting degrees? Yes, I'd call that a participation trophy." A quiet murmur spread across the Democratic side of the committee room. Some of the younger members exchanged knowing looks. They realized Crockett had just maneuvered Levin into confirming exactly what she needed. "Interesting," Crockett said evenly, her tone calm despite the sharpness of Levin's remark. "So you believe you're better qualified to judge the value of someone's legal education and their understanding of the law than the state bar associations that actually license attorneys?" Levin leaned back in his chair, confidence swelling. He thought he was winning. "Congresswoman, passing the bar exam is just the minimum standard," he replied. "It doesn't make someone a constitutional scholar. I've forgotten more about constitutional law than most lawyers will ever learn." That was when Crockett shifted her approach. She reached into her folder and slowly pulled out a thick stack of papers, making sure every camera caught the movement. "Mr. Levin, let's test that claim. You attended Temple University Law School, correct?" "Correct. Class of 1980, he replied. "And you practiced law for how many years before becoming a radio host?" Levin's jaw tightened slightly. "I worked in the Reagan administration and in private practice for several years." "Several years," she repeated. "And when was the last time you actually argued a case in court? Not discussed it on air, but stood before a judge, presenting a legal argument where someone's life or liberty was on the line?" The room went silent except for the faint hum of the C-SPAN cameras adjusting focus. Levin's expression hardened. "My experience in the Reagan administration—" "I didn't ask about political appointments, Mr. Levin," Crockett interrupted smoothly. "I asked when you last practiced law. When was the last time you stayed up all night drafting a brief because your client's freedom depended on it? When did you last handle courtroom procedure so precisely that one small mistake wouldn't cost someone their life?" "This is absurd," Levin snapped, his famous temper breaking through. "My record speaks for itself. I've written 7 best-selling books on the Constitution." "Books," Crockett interjected, cutting in at the perfect moment. "You've written books. I've saved lives in courtrooms. You talk about the law on the radio, I've practiced it. You mock others' legal education behind a microphone, while I've used mine to keep innocent people out of prison. She leaned forward slightly. So tell me, Mr. Levin, do you honestly believe your years of radio commentary make you more qualified to speak on the law than someone who's actually practiced it? Levin's face flushed deep red. His hands tightened on the table. Things were not going his way. My record stands on its own, he insisted. I've influenced more legal thought in this country than your record ever could. Crockett calmly opened her folder again and began pulling out documents one by one. Let's talk about that record, she said. On January 15th of this year, you claimed on your show that Marbury versus Madison was fundamentally about judicial restraint. Would you like to correct that statement now? Or should I explain to the committee why that's entirely wrong? A few legal experts in the audience gasped. Every law student knew that Marbury versus Madison established judicial review, not restraint, a mistake any first-year student would recognize. Levin tried to recover. That's taken out of context. On February 22nd, Crockett continued, not giving him a moment to breathe. You stated that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was never meant to cover voting rights. Should I pull up the congressional record from 1866 to show how incorrect that is? Or would you prefer to revise that statement? The Democratic members struggled to hide their smiles. Some Republicans looked like they were ready to call a recess. On March 10th, she went on, you said there's no constitutional basis for executive agencies to create regulations. Have you actually read Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council? Because I can cite it for you if you'd like. Each correction landed like a hammer. These weren't matters of opinion. They were basic legal facts that Levin had gotten wrong on air. Mistakes any active attorney would have caught instantly. Levin tried to push back, his voice rising to the familiar near shout his radio audience knew so well. This is an ambush. This is exactly the kind of... Crockett's voice sliced through his outburst. Calm but unyielding. You've spent years on your show ridiculing the education of others, questioning whether some people even deserve their law degrees. So, Mr. Levin, perhaps it's time we question yours. You've implied that some of us are merely affirmative action hires who couldn't succeed in actual legal practice. So I'm simply asking you to show the superior legal knowledge you claim to possess, unless, of course, you can't. The trap had been fully set. Levine now faced two options: attempt to answer her legal questions and risk further embarrassment, or refuse and appear as if he was avoiding the challenge. Either way, he was cornered. Let me start with something basic, Crockett continued, her voice softening slightly, which somehow made it sting even more. Can you explain the difference between a motion in limine and a motion for summary judgment? These are routine procedural tools used by practicing attorneys. Levine's mouth opened, then closed again. He recognized the terms vaguely but couldn't recall the procedural distinctions. When was the last time he had actually dealt with courtroom procedure? Crockett didn't stop. All right then. What's the standard for ineffective assistance of counsel under Strickland v. Washington? Every public defender knows this by heart because their clients' lives depend on it. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because you've never had someone's future depend on your command of the law. You've never needed to know it so precisely that a single mistake could cost someone decades behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. The energy in the room shifted entirely. The man who entered as a conservative legal authority now seemed smaller, his expression caught between anger and humiliation. You want to talk about participation trophies, Mr. Levine? Crockett's voice rose slightly, steady but forceful. Your entire media career is a participation trophy. You get to play the role of a legal expert because you attended law school 40 years ago and dabbled in politics. Meanwhile, those of us who actually practice law, who fight for justice every day, have to listen to you question our qualifications, our intelligence, and our right to speak on legal matters. She lifted another document, marked with highlighter throughout. Here's a transcript from your show dated April 5th. You said, and I quote, "These diversity hire lawyers wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real legal debate with someone who actually knows the Constitution." Well, Mr. Levine, we've been here for 15 minutes, and you haven't correctly answered a single substantive legal question. So tell me, who exactly is the diversity hire here? The room erupted. Democratic members broke into applause before the Republican chair called for order. But the damage was already done. Mark Levin, once hailed as a leading conservative legal thinker, had been publicly dismantled on national television by a freshman Congresswoman he had dismissed only moments earlier. Yet Crockett wasn't finished. She had saved her final question for maximum effect. Mr. Levin, I'll give you one last opportunity to redeem yourself. One simple question. Something any first-year law student could answer. It's so fundamental that it appears on nearly every bar exam. Can you explain the doctrine of incorporation and how the Bill of Rights applies to state governments through the 14th Amendment? This was foundational constitutional law, material every constitutional scholar should know instinctively. The room fell silent. Levin began to respond, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. The doctrine of incorporation. It's about how the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment. He trailed off, fumbling. The man who had spent years lecturing America about constitutional law couldn't explain one of its most basic concepts. Let me help you, Crockett said gently, her tone almost sympathetic now. The doctrine of incorporation is the legal principle through which the Bill of Rights, originally applying only to the federal government, has been extended to the states via the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. This can occur through selective or total incorporation. The Supreme Court has applied it in landmark cases such as Gitlow v. New York for free speech, Mapp v. Ohio for search and seizure, and McDonald v. Chicago for the Second Amendment. This isn't advanced theory, Mr. Levin. We teach this in Week 2 of constitutional law. A heavy silence filled the chamber. Even the Republican members avoided eye contact with Levin. He had been decisively and publicly humbled. But Crockett had one final point to make. She lifted another document, holding it up for the cameras. This is my law degree, Mr. Levin, from the University of Houston Law Center, the same school you've dismissed on your show as second tier. And this, she continued, holding up another document, is my Texas bar certification, something you haven't maintained in decades. These, she added, displaying a stack of papers, represent a few of the cases I've handled, the appeals I've argued, and the clients whose lives I've impacted through actual legal work. Not theory, not commentary, but real practice. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on Levin's visibly unsettled face. You see, Mr. Levin, the difference between us isn't that you went to Temple and I went to Houston. It's not race or gender. The real difference is that I'm a practicing attorney, one who does real legal work every day, while you're a radio host who left the profession decades ago and have relied on outdated credentials ever since. Yet you continue to question the abilities of those who are actually in the field. She paused, letting the silence emphasize her words. So, the next time you mock someone's law degree on your show, or imply that certain lawyers are just diversity hires or token appointees, remember this exchange. Remember that when you finally faced an active lawyer, one who practices the law daily, you couldn't answer questions that even first-year law students should know. Levin tried to recover, saying this is character assassination. No, Mr. Levin, Crockett interrupted calmly. This is what happens when you build a career on arrogance and condescension without the knowledge to support it. This is what happens when you mistake having a platform for having expertise. And this is what happens when someone who truly understands the law calls your bluff. She neatly gathered her documents, her demeanor composed and professional. I have no further questions for this witness, Mr. Chairman. I believe Mr. Levin's qualifications to speak on constitutional issues have been adequately clarified for the record. The gavel struck, a formality at that point. Everyone present understood they had just witnessed a significant moment. Mark Levin, once praised for his supposed legal intellect, had been revealed as exactly what many critics long suspected. A commentator living off credentials from decades past, attacking lawyers who were actively doing the work he no longer practiced. As Levin sat there, his face shifting between shades of red and frustration, cameras recorded every detail. His staff seated behind him appeared stunned. They had arrived expecting clips of their boss outsmarting his critics. Instead, they were watching his reputation unravel on national television. Even the committee chair, a longtime ally, announced a recess without meeting Levin's eyes. Conservative media figures in the audience quickly reached for their phones, some to strategize, others to distance themselves from what was clearly a damaging moment. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood, adjusted her jacket, and exited the hearing room with quiet confidence. She didn't celebrate or boast. She had achieved what she intended, exposing a commentator who had spent years belittling professionals like her. And she had done it with facts, law, and preparation, the marks of a real attorney. As she passed Levin's table, she paused briefly. "Mr. Levin," she said evenly, loud enough for the microphones to pick up, "I'll be tuning in to your show tonight. I'm curious to hear how you plan to explain this. Although, based on today's performance, I'm not sure you understand what spin means in a legal sense either." Levin opened his mouth as if to respond but said nothing. For the first time in his career, he was speechless. Within minutes of the recess, the clip went viral. "Crockett destroys Levin" became one of the fastest trending topics on social media. The video showing Crockett methodically dismantling Levin's legal arguments spread across platforms. Liberal commentators called it the most satisfying political exchange in years, while even some conservatives conceded that Levin appeared unprepared and outmatched. Politico was the first major outlet to publish the story, with a headline that soon became famous. The Great One? Mark Levin stumbles through basic legal questions in chaotic hearing. The article outlined each of Levin's mistakes, supported by fact-checks from constitutional scholars who confirmed Crockett's accuracy. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin tweeted, "In 30 years of covering legal affairs, I've never seen a more thorough dismantling in a congressional hearing." Crockett didn't just win the debate. She revealed that Levin lacks a fundamental grasp of the law he claims to master. Even Fox News, Levin's ideological base, struggled to defend him. During the Five, Greg Gutfeld awkwardly commented that everyone has bad days, MOCKS, while Jesse Waters tried redirecting the conversation. Only Sean Hannity attempted a defense, suggesting Levin was ambushed, though even he seemed unconvinced. The strongest reaction came from the legal community online. Professors who had remained silent about Levin for years finally spoke up. Harvard's Lawrence Tribe posted a detailed thread outlining Levin's errors, calling it a clear example of what happens when political rhetoric replaces genuine legal understanding. Lamar, often seen as a moderate, wrote, "For years, Levin has questioned the qualifications of others while presenting himself as a constitutional expert, a reputation he neither earned nor deserves. Representative Crockett has done the legal community a service by exposing this." But the most serious response came from conservative legal circles. Several Federalist Society members, speaking anonymously, admitted to reporters that they had long known Levin was more performer than lawyer, but had stayed silent because he benefited their cause. One prominent conservative attorney told the Daily Beast, "We've all cringed when Levin goes on air and gets basic legal principles wrong, but his large audience made him untouchable. Crockett did what we should have done years ago." By that evening, Levin's radio program became must-listen radio, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. Millions tuned in, waiting to hear his response to the public embarrassment. Would he apologize? Admit his errors? Attempt to fact-check Crockett's fact-checks? What came next was even more damaging than the confrontation itself. Levin spent the entire first hour of his show railing against what he called radical left ambush tactics and a lack of respect for conservative voices. He ignored every legal mistake Crockett had identified and offered no clarification for his repeated misinterpretation of basic constitutional concepts. Instead, he went after Crockett personally, calling her unqualified and implying she had been coached by radical law professors. The backlash was swift and harsh. Even his longtime listeners began to turn on him. One devoted fan from Texas said live on air, "Mark, I've listened to you for 15 years, but that Congresswoman was right. You couldn't answer simple questions. How can you call her unqualified when she clearly understands the law better than you?" Levin abruptly cut the caller off and went to a commercial break, but the fallout had already begun. His YouTube channel, normally filled with supportive comments, was flooded with viewers posting timestamps of his past legal blunders. Amateur fact-checkers combed through his archives, finding dozens of instances where he had misstated fundamental legal ideas while belittling others. Conservative media figures scrambled to contain the fallout. Ben Shapiro tried defending Levin, arguing that knowing courtroom procedures doesn't make one a constitutional scholar, but even his followers pushed back, noting that Levin had failed on both procedural and constitutional points. Tucker Carlson attempted to frame the issue as an attack from woke culture against traditional voices. But that narrative fell apart when viewers observed that Crockett had relied entirely on legal facts and Levin's own words. The memes were perhaps the most humiliating blow. Within hours, Mark Levin Law School became shorthand for pretending to understand something you don't. Clips of Levin's red-faced fumbling were turned into GIFs with captions like, "When someone asks you to back up your tweet with facts." A viral TikTok featured a law student watching the exchange, saying, "This is why you actually pay attention in con law, folks." Yet the biggest shift came for Jasmine Crockett herself. Overnight, she went from being a relatively unknown freshman congresswoman to a national name. Her Twitter following grew by over 500,000 in just 2 days. Invitations poured in from law schools nationwide. MSNBC offered her a regular legal analyst position, and publishers approached her with book deals. More importantly, she reshaped the conversation about what qualifies as legal authority in politics. For too long, figures like Levin had claimed expertise based on old credentials and loud rhetoric, rather than real understanding or experience. Crockett demonstrated that genuine knowledge could and should challenge false authority. Law schools began using the clip in professional responsibility, courses as a case study on the dangers of overstating expertise. The Texas Bar Association even issued a statement commending her for reinforcing the importance of legal accuracy and accountability in public discourse. Crockett's performance highlighted the distinction between those who genuinely practice law and those who simply talk about it. The Congressional Black Caucus issued a statement praising her, saying, "Representative Crockett's outstanding defense of true legal expertise over media showmanship illustrates why diverse voices in Congress are essential." She brought not only a different perspective but demonstrated superior preparation and understanding, exposing the weakness of attacks on our qualifications. Just 3 days after the hearing, an unprecedented event occurred. Mark Levin's radio syndicator Westwood One announced a shift in the show's format, moving away from legal analysis toward broader conservative commentary. Industry insiders reported that advertisers were withdrawing after the controversy, concerned about associating with someone whose supposed legal expertise had been publicly challenged. Levin attempted to recover by inviting sympathetic guests to defend him, but even they struggled. When he brought on Jay Sekulow to vouch for his credentials, Sekulow notably avoided supporting Levin's specific legal arguments, instead offering general comments about Levin's passion for the Constitution. A week later, the American Bar Association Journal published an editorial titled, "The Crockett Hearing, A Lesson in Legal Competence." While it didn't mention Levin directly, it emphasized the value of real-world legal practice in maintaining professional skill and warned against relying on outdated credentials as proof of current expertise. Representative Crockett handled her growing recognition with professionalism and purpose. In her first major interview after the hearing with Rachel Maddow, she stated, "This wasn't about embarrassing Mr. Levin, though I understand why people see it that way. It was about standing up for every lawyer who's been told their education or background wasn't good enough by someone who hasn't practiced law in decades." She continued, "I've represented clients whose lives depended on my knowledge of the law. I've argued cases where one small mistake could mean someone loses their children or their freedom. That's real legal work. That's what earns someone the authority to speak about the law, not a radio show, not book sales, not political appointments from 40 years ago. It's about current, practical experience." The interview went viral, amplifying her message. Crockett wasn't gloating, she was educating. She used her platform, earned through preparation and expertise, to make a broader point about credibility, authority, and who defines intellectual legitimacy in America. Law schools began inviting her to speak at their commencements. The University of Houston Law Center, her alma mater, which Levin had dismissed as second-rate, reported a 30% increase in applications the week following the hearing. The dean released a statement saying, "Representative Crockett has proven that the quality of legal education isn't determined by prestige or rankings, but by what you do with it. She's a credit to our institution and the legal field." Meanwhile, Levin's influence was collapsing. His book sales fell sharply, speaking engagements were quietly canceled, and Republican politicians who once sought his platform began declining invitations. Blaze TV, where he hosted a show, chose not to renew his contract 2 months later. The final setback came when Levin submitted an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal defending himself. The paper, which had long published his work, rejected it. A source told Politico that editors felt Levin's credibility as a legal commentator had eroded, and publishing him would undermine the paper's reputation for serious conservative commentary. 3 months after the hearing, a Media Matters study revealed Levin's radio audience had dropped 40%, with stations in major markets such as Houston, Atlanta, and Philadelphia dropping his show. Podcast downloads were down 60%. The man once seen as conservative talk radio's leading legal authority was quickly fading into irrelevance. Yet the broader impact went beyond Levin's personal decline. The hearing sparked a national conversation about expertise and authority. Other conservative commentators became more cautious about exaggerating their credentials, while liberal commentators, inspired by Crockett's example, began more rigorously fact-checking legal claims in conservative media. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered political vocabulary, referring to thoroughly preparing to dismantle false claims of expertise. Law students studied her questioning technique as a model of effective cross-examination, and several law schools added the hearing to their trial advocacy curricula as a case study in managing a combative witness. Crockett's legislative work also gained new momentum. Bills that had previously struggled for attention began attracting co-sponsors. Her opinions carried more weight in committee meetings, and even Republican colleagues started listening with respect when she spoke on legal matters. She had proven herself not just as a politician who discussed the law, but as a deeply knowledgeable legal professional serving in Congress. 6 months later, Crockett was invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Bar Association's annual convention. Her speech, "The Practice of Law versus the Performance of Law," explored the difference between genuine legal work and public punditry. She never mentioned Levin by name, but everyone understood the reference. "Too often," she told the packed audience, "we allow those who perform law on television or radio to claim the same authority as those who practice it every day. We often mistake loudness for knowledge, confidence for competence, and platforms for expertise. But law isn't a show, it's a profession. It demands ongoing study, consistent updates, and real engagement with cases and their consequences." The speech earned a 5-minute standing ovation. Legal Twitter called it the final blow to performative legal commentary. Even a few conservative lawyers quietly admitted she had a point. A year later, Mark Levin made one last attempt at relevance. He launched a new podcast called The Real Constitution, promising to clarify legal misunderstandings. The first episode drew decent attention, mostly from curiosity. But by the 5th episode, his audience had dropped below 10,000 listeners. The man who once reached millions could no longer sustain even a modest following. Then came the final twist. The University of Houston Law Center announced the creation of the Jasmine Crockett Chair in Constitutional Practice, funded by donations that poured in after the hearing. The endowment supported professors who blended academic scholarship with real-world legal experience. At the announcement, Crockett stated, "This chair represents the belief that the best legal education combines theory with practice, books with courtrooms, study with experience. It's meant for professors who don't just teach the law but have lived it." The ceremony received coverage from all major news outlets. Legal figures across the political spectrum attended. In a small corner of conservative Twitter, Mark Levin posted a bitter message accusing legal education of being corrupted by identity politics. It received only 47 likes, in a sharp contrast to the thousands he once garnered. The transformation was complete. The man once celebrated as conservative media's top legal thinker had become a resentful figure shouting into the void. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett had risen as one of the most respected legal voices in Congress. Her credibility rested not on ideology or performance, but on mastery of the law and rigorous preparation. 2 years after that pivotal hearing, the impact of what became known as the Crockett cross-examination still resonated through American politics and legal culture. Law schools analyzed it as a model of effective questioning. Political strategists studied it as a blueprint for challenging powerful opponents. Media analysts cited it as the turning point when performative expertise began losing influence in public discourse. Crockett went on to become the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, her legal background making her one of Congress's most authoritative voices on legal issues. She later authored a best-selling book, Practice Over Performance: Reclaiming Expertise in American Life. which became required reading in law and political science programs nationwide. She never forgot the principle she proved that day, that true expertise, grounded in preparation and experience, always outlasts bluster and outdated credentials. In every hearing, floor speech, and interview, she maintained the same thorough preparation that had once dismantled Mark Levin. She became known as one of the most prepared members of Congress, someone who never made a claim without supporting evidence. Levin's downfall became a cautionary tale in conservative media. His name turned into a warning about overstating one's expertise. Younger commentators grew more cautious, ensuring their claims were supported by verifiable facts. The era of inflated experts began to fade, replaced by a renewed respect for genuine knowledge and professional competence. The wider legal community also felt the shift. The American Bar Association introduced new continuing education standards, emphasizing that lawyers who presented themselves as experts in media or public forums must maintain current, practical knowledge. Several states adopted similar regulations, warning that publicly claiming legal expertise without maintaining competence could constitute an ethical breach. Political discourse began to evolve, slowly but noticeably. Politicians became more careful about asserting expertise they didn't possess. Commentators began referencing specific statutes and cases instead of making broad, unsupported claims about the law. The bar for credible legal commentary had been raised, and Jasmine Crockett had set it. In law schools across the country, a new generation of attorneys studied the Crockett hearing as proof that preparation is power. They learned that facts could overcome bias, that evidence could defeat fame, and that authentic expertise always exposes false authority. Young lawyers, especially women and people of color, who had been told their credentials weren't enough, saw in Crockett's success a blueprint for their own. The legal profession itself entered what many described as a new era of accountability and integrity. The Crockett effect took hold. Applications to law schools from underrepresented groups increased sharply. Public defender offices that once struggled to attract talent began receiving interest from top graduates eager to gain the kind of real courtroom experience Crockett had shown to be invaluable. The actual practice of law, rather than just discussing it, earned new respect and prestige. Conservative media also saw a shift. The next wave of conservative legal commentators made sure to keep their bar memberships active, stay informed on legal developments, and base their arguments on solid legal reasoning rather than pure ideology. Levin's public embarrassment had taught them that in the internet age you couldn't pretend to be an expert. Every claim could be checked, and every mistake would live online forever. Progressive outlets learned as well. They recognized the value of preparation and the need for truly informed voices, not just passionate ones. Legal commentary standards rose notably on MSNBC and CNN, with producers seeking out active attorneys and current scholars rather than former prosecutors or political figures from years past. The hearing also transformed how congressional proceedings were handled. Committee members began preparing more seriously, knowing any exchange could later be reviewed or fact-checked. The overall quality of questioning improved as representatives realized they could no longer rely on scripted talking points. They had to genuinely understand the issues at hand. 5 years after the hearing that changed everything, Jasmine Crockett stood before the Supreme Court, arguing a major constitutional case on voting rights. She had taken a leave from Congress to argue it personally, saying it was too important to delegate. As she stood before the 9 justices, observers noted the remarkable path that brought her there, from a lesser-known law school to Congress, and now to the nation's highest court. Crockett had proven that merit came not from pedigree but from preparation, knowledge, and the courage to challenge false authority. Her dismantling of Mark Levin had been only the beginning of a career that would redefine American legal and political discussion. As she began her argument, calm, confident, and fluent in legal precedent, it was impossible not to recall that earlier congressional hearing, when a young lawmaker had stood up to an overconfident pundit and revealed the difference between talking about the law and truly knowing it. Mark Levin, meanwhile, had largely vanished from public view. His radio show was canceled after collapsing ratings. His book stopped selling and his social media presence dwindled to a small group of bitter supporters who claimed he'd been ambushed. He became a cautionary tale in media studies about arrogance and the need for genuine expertise. Yet his downfall served a purpose. It proved that in an era of instant information, false knowledge couldn't last. It showed that preparation and authentic expertise always prevail over noise and ego. It demonstrated that the traditional gatekeepers of intellectual authority, those who relied on outdated credentials and loud opinions, could be challenged and defeated by those who truly did the work. The legal field emerged stronger, and a new generation of lawyers and leaders learned that real authority comes not from claiming expertise, but from demonstrating it. Not from talking about the law, but from practicing it. Not from mocking others' credentials, but from proving your own. As Jasmine Crockett concluded her Supreme Court argument to rare applause from the gallery, she thought back to that pivotal day in Congress. The day she decided that someone had to stand up to figures like Mark Levin and prove that genuine expertise can't be faked. That knowledge and preparation would always expose false authority. She hadn't just ended Levin's career that day. She had set a new benchmark for what it means to be a true legal expert in America, a standard built on current knowledge, real-world experience, and careful preparation rather than outdated titles and empty rhetoric that would influence American legal and political dialogue for years to come. The message was clear. In the contest between performance and practice, between pretending to know and truly understanding, between false authority and real knowledge, the truth will always prevail. It only takes someone with the courage, discipline, and skill to reveal it. Jasmine Crockett was that person, and American discourse has never been the same since. If you've watched this far, you've witnessed one of the most significant political moments in recent memory. This story wasn't just about one Congresswoman confronting a media personality. It was about the standards we set for expertise in this country. Like and subscribe for more real stories that mainstream media won't cover. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss our next video, where we reveal another powerful political showdown the establishment would rather you didn't see. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did Jasmine Crockett end Mark Levin's career? Or was this simply justice served? We read every comment. Until next time, this is your source for honest, unfiltered political truth.